So we're in lecture number 5, and we've talked about the war a little bit, the Houston Mutiny, the Black American troops who served in France, and now we're coming home, sort of like those soldiers, but we are coming to look at what happens at home actually during those same war years, while those 400,000 black men in the military are over in Europe. So here at home, these war years, and we should think here of the Great Migration as 1914 to 1919. And we'll see later that it sort of dies down right after the war, but then by the mid-20s, there's sort of a second wave of migration. But right here during the war, 1914 to 1919, 1 million black people leave the South. 1 million black people in about a 5-year period. And let's try to sort of lay out the factors that lead to this great migration. So, first, because of the war, unemployment in the overall country drops to a very, very low level. Unemployment drops because of the wartime production to make all this stuff for the war. At the same time that unemployment is low, there are 4 million men out of the economy because they're in the military. That helps contribute to that low unemployment rate. Third, jobs in the industrial economy that would have been taken by immigrants before the war now were open to black people. Because during those war years, the country had shut down immigration. There essentially were no immigrants. And so jobs in the bottom rungs of the industrial economy, which had always been competed for by different kinds of European immigrants, would now be opened up to black people. So all of these are sort of the pull factors, drawing those 1 million black people from the South. But there was more than that. There was also the pull from Northern press, like the Chicago Defender, which told Southern black people that the North was a comparative land of freedom and opportunity. Now, note that comparative part, because the subscribers in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana are aware of these stories from publications like Robert Abbott's Chicago Defender, that the North offers more opportunity. And that, too, is a pull factor. But in a way, that opportunity can't matter too much without a job to wind up with when you get there. So all of these are pull factors. But there were also some push factors. There were, in these years, some really bad floods in Mississippi and Alabama that destroyed the cotton crop, and sharecroppers were kicked out. But bigger than those floods, which are sort of on the edge of this, was this little fella, a cotton-eating insect, the boll weevil, which moved through the cotton South in the same years that those industrial jobs were opening up in the North. So the boll weevil, the destruction of the cotton crop, is sort of putting sharecroppers out of work at the same time that they're hearing stories that there is work in those northern cities. So note the sort of direction of the arrows in the Great Migration, because in general, black people from down in Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, they sort of move up along the East Coast to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, while black people from Alabama and Mississippi are more likely to move up to places like St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit. And that means that the black population of many of these northern industrial cities goes shooting upwards in a way that the longtime residents of those cities weren't used to, including in cities like Philadelphia and New York City, where there had been black populations for a long time. They're not used to the sudden influx of black people from places like South Carolina and Florida who sound different, who seem different, and are different. So look at some of these cities, though, out here in the Midwest, like Cleveland and Detroit, where there were just tiny, tiny black populations until the Great Migration. And if you look down here, the black population of Cleveland goes up by 611% from 1910 to 1920. So these are dramatic changes in these places. This picture here is not showing you the beginning part of the Great Migration. The first part of the Great Migration was usually when a man of the family went north, taking those railroad systems through the South, sometimes with so little to start with. He would actually work his way to one city, find day labor for a few days or a couple weeks, save enough to get to another city, working his way up to Chicago or New York or whatever the final destination was. So this means that these men are going because they've heard stories, there's been recruitment, but they're really leaving everything they know behind. The decision to move in the Great Migration was momentous. It's a different society to sort of uproot yourself and move away, which is still hard for most people today. So that man goes first. He finds some terrible, terrible industrial job, but is he used to terrible labor? Of course he is. He's been black in the South. So he gets some industrial job, and even at the bottom rungs of Chicago or New York or Detroit's industrial economy, he's making $3 to $5 a day. And you're thinking, oh my God, that's terrible. But $3 to $5 a day compared to the 75 cents that he would have made as a day laborer in the South. 75 cents compared to $4 or $5 a day, this is transformative. So he saves his money from that factory job and sometimes brings family members up one at a time. Other times, saves enough to bring the rest of the family together. Brothers, children, sometimes parents and cousins. And these new black migrants created neighborhoods of their own in these northern cities. Paradise Valley became the black neighborhood of Detroit. The Hill District became the black neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And on it went in every city. The east side of Cleveland, the south side of Chicago. And look here at Chicago's population, Chicago's black population, which goes from 50,000 in 1910 to 200,000 by 1930, after, like I said, this second wave of migration that we will talk more about in the 20s. Many black people went to Chicago as much because of the Chicago Defender as they did because of any job they had heard about. In fact, the Chicago Defender made a place like Chicago sound so great that some of those black migrants wound up disappointed. Disappointed because although there was no legal segregation here, and although they could exercise their right to vote, white supremacy was strong. And they found themselves disproportionately arrested and convicted by police forces that usually had no black officers and sometimes just a few. They found themselves discriminated against in housing, which is part of what keeps them in neighborhoods like the South Side. So this is a complex thing, because the formation of these neighborhoods is partially by choice. Because many of these black people have uprooted and moved from Alabama or Mississippi to Chicago. There's comfort, there's security in all living together in the South Side of Chicago. So the complex part comes when you want to move out, when you want to move to some other part of the city. And there, you found that almost no one would rent to you. Almost no bank would give you a loan if you were trying to buy. And if you somehow moved around that discrimination and moved into a different neighborhood, well then, 58 black people's homes were bombed in these wartime years as they move in Chicago. And these are black people who've moved in on what white people take to be their neighborhoods. Harlem was the black neighborhood that grew to be the biggest of all. From a 1910 population of 90,000 to 360,000 in 1930. Harlem and Chicago and places like it were essentially all black neighborhoods, but they were not what you might think of as a ghetto. Well, in one sense of the term, they were, in a sort of classic sense that it's one group of people there. But maybe a better way to think of it is that it's not a slum, in that it's not uniformly run down, dilapidated. Because in Harlem lives New York's black middle class, as does most of New York's poor, as does New York's black upper class. So in one sense, they're segregated, but they're economically integrated. And that made them stronger neighborhoods, with institutions and coherence, with Elks branches and Masons and NAACP chapters. In fact, the NAACP moved its headquarters to Harlem. And from these neighborhoods, black people could exercise their right to vote. And they began using it, electing black people first to city councils. Think about the fact that they are sort of concentrated in one neighborhood. And as those neighborhoods become bigger and bigger, it becomes almost impossible to deny them a seat, at least one, on the city's council. So, from those city councils, from bigger neighborhoods, well, Oscar DePriest here was a black resident of Chicago, and in 1915 becomes the first ever black person on Chicago's city council, which is actually not called the city council, but we'll let it slide. So he becomes the first ever black member of the city council in 1915, and then think of how Chicago's black population grows in the years after that. And by 1928, Oscar DePriest was elected to the House of Representatives, because the South Side was almost big enough to be its own congressional voting district. So DePriest becomes the first black member of the House of Representatives since 1900, since that representative from Wilmington left after the Wilmington riot. So it's been 28 years since there's been a black person in the federal government. DePriest now makes it one. So one of the results of the Great Migration is political power. And another is an increased ability to use their freedom of speech, their right to assemble, to gather, to protest, to raise some hell. A. Philip Randolph left Florida at the very beginnings of the Great Migration because he realized that there was really never going to be opportunity, it seemed, in a place like Florida. He made his way to Harlem. He took classes at City College. He became entranced by socialism. He met Chandler Owen, a Columbia law student, and A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen studied socialism together, and then, during the war, they began publishing The Messenger. And the subtitle of it there was "The Only Radical Negro Magazine in America." Randolph and Owen believed that it was capitalism that created racism. As Randolph put it, he said, "When there is no profit to be made from race friction, there will be no race friction." So they were railing against capitalism, urging workers to stand together, and then, during the war, they began urging black people to refuse to serve in the war. Randolph pointed out that black people had served this country in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and he said, what has happened since the last time we served this country in the Spanish-American War? Things have gotten worse. This strategy that we're going to prove ourselves is a fiction. Don't fall for it. Don't serve this country that doesn't treat you equally. And for this, Randolph was arrested and charged with treason. Turns out, during the war, the Congress had actually passed a law called the Espionage Act that made it a crime to criticize the federal government. Together with a Sedition Act, these laws were used to try to silence criticism of the government. And Randolph was among the hundreds who wound up imprisoned during the war years. So Randolph we bring up here, but he's going to be back in our story again and again. He's going to be out of prison in the 20s, organizing for those black railroad workers. And so as we head into part 2, that sort of fighting spirit from The Messenger is really just the beginning.